I think you just got a reminder, we'll be recording. We're going to start with some memories. And so I would like to offer that our panelists will each answer this prompt. If they could share an early memory of when or how you encountered racial bigotry. Suzanne, could you start?
Sure. Thank you, Wendy. And thank you for this opportunity to be here today. I'm quite honored. When I was in third grade, well, for my childhood, we lived in Lincoln near Branch Library over at 27th and South area. And my parents, this was a, redlining, it was a redlining District A. So there could be deed restrictions on race and religion of who you could sell to, who could live in the area. My parents bought a home, and to make ends meet, they rented out the basement as an apartment. A Black couple rented the apartment. He was in the military, and what I've since learned is that officers were not allowed to live on base. He was a 6-month assignment at Lincoln Air Base. So my parents rented the basement to them. It so outraged the neighbors that they get, one neighbor organized the rest of the neighbors. They blocked the streets so the couple couldn't park on the street. They slit their tires. We had burning crosses on our front porch, our lawn, harassing phone calls. My friends were not allowed to play with me anymore. So that was a really, really harsh way to learn about this. Friends at church would not talk to my parents anymore. But once the Black couple moved out, they were only for 6 months because that was his commitment. Everybody went back to like nothing had happened. My mother and my father never talked about it again. I think the trauma of the betrayal, pain, they just never brought it up. It was a business contract and we honored it. I know from them it's much more. We can't hear you, Wendy, you're muted.
Thank you. Joanne, I had muted myself because I heard a little background noise. Joanne, please.
Yeah, so thanks again for having us here. So I and Suzanne got together to talk about this because I was searching my brain trying to remember something early. I grew up in the Nebraska Sandhills in north central Nebraska, and we had very little diversity. We had one Lakota family that lived in the community where I went to school, and the one of the boys was a couple years younger than I was. He played on the basketball team. I don't remember any bullying or bigotry against the family at all. And so probably my earliest memory was when I went to the University of Nebraska Lincoln as a non-traditional student back in the like 1986. And I had a class, and there was a white woman in my class whose husband was African American, and she was talking about all of the trouble they were having trying to purchase a house. And I think they lived in Omaha, and I believe he was a serviceman. But that was like my first clue that there was a problem. I feel badly about that because I was my late 20s at that time. So I didn't grow up. I grew up with people who had fetal alcohol syndrome, and I know that those kids got bullied a little bit. And but as far as any kind of racial bigotry, I was really immune to that.
Thank you. Cousin Bob.
Story. I don't know who's talking next, but is it okay to share?
You know what? We're going to ask questions of the panelists for the first section of this section, and then I hope that we will have time to ask others to share. I honor your interest in doing so. Thank you.
So I grew up in Omaha, and we would spend hours discussing what absorbed into my soul things like job segregation, what you thought people could and couldn't do, who were Black people that had what jobs, what the public view of was advertising and magazines and newspapers and all of that stuff that sort of creates the way you inherit the world. And I inherited a racist view. I consider myself an anti-racist, but there's no question we would have to unpack a lot more to get into that. But the first time it was tangible to me was summer between my 8th and 9th grade. I went to Wentworth Military Academy for a summer school program. It was the only place in the United States where before you entered 9th grade, you could get high school credits for an English class. And I went to Wentworth Military Academy. I was the first Jew with one other, and the first Black kid was there at the same time. He happened to be the child of a Marine Corps sergeant, happened to be a black belt in karate, and could take care of himself very well, thank you very much. But both the Black kid who became a close friend and myself were subjected to some pretty nasty stuff during the summer. The town we lived in was Lexington, Missouri. The town was divided right down the middle. There was a Black town and a white town. And the city hall had a cannonball in the front of it in one of the columns that was from the Civil War. And there was no question that the sides of towns did not go near each other. And I smelt and felt racism in a very Southern kind of way, and very close to my own experience with anti-Semitism, to see that racism and anti-Semitism were sort of flip sides of the same coin.
Thank you. Now, I honor that I didn't start with introductions, and I was intentional in that, because I think sometimes we frame hearing someone else's story in knowing the assumptions that we make about their past or how they present. And so I'd just like to pause and realize how you've come to know these three people who will talk to us today. And you started by opening to hear a life experience about them and then invite them into not only this conversation, but into your life, in knowing something deeply intimate about them. And that really changes how you've come to be introduced to these three humans. So I want to now invite each of them to tell us why they're part of this panel today, and then we will continue. So if you could just each tell us a little bit about the skills that you have gathered on your path to understanding this topic, and why you showed up to help us understand this lens of white toolkit in relation to racism today. And we'll go backwards. So Bob, how about if you start?
Sure, I'm a child of Omaha. I'm Wendy's cousin, proud to be so. Born and raised here, went away to college, came back to go to Creighton Law School, practiced law for 9 years, and then became the executive director of the Midwest office of the Anti-Defamation League in Omaha for 18 years. And then I went to New York and became the senior executive in charge of all 28 offices in the United States. And ADL's main mission is to fight bigotry and injustice and to fight racism and anti-Semitism. So I was deeply steeped for over 30 years in the education, confronting, litigation, persuasion, all of the different ways that these issues present themselves.
Thank you. Joanne.
Yes, so I ended up working for Omaha Public Library, and I was the branch manager at the Charles B. Washington Branch Library, which was at 28th and Ames. So I became a minority in the workplace, and met a lot of African-American people who are working on really terrific things. A lot of great projects there, and made some really good friends with some people. And also, saw a little bit of what people in poverty and especially African Americans endure, and the assumptions people make, about them. And one of the things that happened to me when I was there is we always had to maintain, the library, so it was comfortable for everyone. And we did have a lot of kids that came into the library after school. In fact, we had teen programs in the summer, a teen lock-in on Friday nights, and we would limit it to 75. And on Friday afternoons, the kids didn't want to be left out of that. And so there would be 75 teens in the library and everybody else that's trying to do everything. So a lot of trying to keep the peace with everybody so everybody could enjoy the library. And so we did have to call the police and ban a lot of kids for being disruptive from the library. And so that's heart-wrenching, because I think most of my understanding besides that experience has come from just my knowledge and reading of the school to prison pipeline. And it's like, we want to do everything to keep the kids from having encounters with the police or having the police at the library, but sometimes it was unavoidable. And this one time we had to call the police. That was a disruptive teen girl. She was African American, and I was in the teen room with her when the police arrived, and it was just one single white policeman. And she just was refusing to leave and being belligerent and probably very teenish, a lot of teen behaviors there. But this policeman took her down, like tripped her and, got her on the floor and had her hands behind her back. And I'm thinking, I guess it was just kind of like from 0 to 60 for me at that point. And I always tried to reason and don't go physical, but just try to reason, you need to leave, come back tomorrow, things are going to be better. But I think after George Floyd was murdered this summer, and then there was a whole outcry of people wanting to know what they could do. And how I got into this, I'm since retired from the library, but how I got into this was Malcolm X had a program, and they invited people because they had a lot of people that called and were interested in doing something, but what can we do? And so they set up this program, and one of the persons invited to speak was David Compt from the Dialogue Company. And so I ended up taking a series of classes with David, which Suzanne and I and Bob were all participants in that. And there was train the trainer classes. And so Suzanne said, hey, I am wanting to teach this. Does anybody want to help? Are you available? And I was like, I'm game. So that is how I got into this. It's been a long trip of awareness, but Suzanne has got me totally hooked.
Suzanne, can you add a bit as you talk about David? Can you kind of unpack that who he is, and we'll get into his method a little later in the conversation.
Sure. This is kind of a silver lining of the pandemic. And I'm not sure I can say about George Floyd's murder being a silver lining, but David lives in North Carolina, and I would have never met David or been able to do the same training that Bob and Joanne, there were 9 of us who got trained as trainers of the many that started. David, a PhD in, I think it's mechanical engineering, but he was selected as part of Clinton's team to address diversity. So he's been working with this for 30, 40 years. The race method, I don't know when exactly he created it. It is his trademark work. And he goes all around the country and corporations and works with diversity and understanding how to have what drew me in. Two things. One, I lived in Houston for 25 years, and coming back to Omaha or coming to Nebraska was a real difficult transition because it's a very different culture here. And I needed something that I could offer. And what I found in David's work that truly moves me is the foundation is empathy and compassion. And I think those are our superpowers in the world. If we're going to make peace, we have to have empathy and compassion for the other people, for whomever we meet. And that's what drew me in. I'll share just one small story that David shared that really drew me in. His father was one of the, few or small number of Blacks who used the GI Bill, and his dad went on to get a PhD in engineering, and no one would hire a Black engineer. So he got the PhD, but he never got to work as an engineer. And that I found that a very interesting foundation for his work.
Thank you. Suzanne, I'll ask you this next question first. How today do you understand how you as a white or white presenting person understand the point of privilege in your life experiences or perhaps your early experiences to date?
I told the story of 1963 in Lincoln, Nebraska, and what my family went through. And it never occurred to me until, in the last decade, that ended in my life. My best friend never became my best friend again, but I was able to move on in my life. But for that couple, that very, very brave couple that moved in our neighborhood, that was their life every day. I could walk away from the pain of that situation. I don't know who they are or where they are now. And that is definitely privilege. That is definitely privilege.
Thank you. Bob?
Yeah, so Wendy, it's a great question. Another one of those questions that we could spend hours on. And since we're in the job of constructing sort of an understanding in a language of meaning for each other, let's just say that there are a beginning question that one has to ask oneself about privilege. And that is, what's your view of it? Do you view a normal life as a white person as having experienced privilege and having privilege? Or do you think privilege is something that is tangible, that happens to you, that you get treated better than a Black candidate, you get treated better in a store, that you see the discrimination? Is that what privilege is? And I think that's a really deep and underlying question. For it raises the question of what's our responsibility as white people. That if you're white in the United States, privilege is not having to worry about the myriad of issues that people who are the other experience. Race is one of the issues. It's the original sin of America. It's a deep, deep problem, but it's not the only way that we're treated as other. We're treated as other based on religion, on color of skin, on LGBTQ, on all sorts of men and women. That privileges come and depends on your lens as to whether you think it. There is no question that I experienced life as an accelerated white person. I had a better education, I had better access to education, I had better resources to buy help if I needed it. I was ahead of the game than similarly situated people who were native, native people, brown, Black, all sorts of things. And that you have to ask yourself, do you believe that or not?
So Bob, you have the fortune or unfortune of me knowing your story particularly well. So our family has a tradition of singing songs that are reframed to Broadway shows as a part of a family tradition. And when Bob Wolfson and Sibby got married, one of the songs went something like, Bobby Wolfson went to college, 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 dying new. All right. So that is ingrained in my mind. If you were Black, you know, all those knocking downs and another opportunity would not have presented itself.
I eventually graduated with an undergraduate degree from Columbia University. I went to Washington University twice, Creighton University, University of Nebraska at Lincoln, and then finally Columbia University and the Jewish Theological Seminary at the same time. Almost all of those, with probably the exception of UNL and Creighton, where I didn't spend that much time, would have been very difficult when the time I went for an African American to be at. And the population of African Americans at those Ivy League schools were very small.
Yeah. It's just the reality of the things that we take for granted, like buying a house in addition to access to education. And I know that the conversation around privilege is very, very difficult for those of us who have had many, many bumps in their lives, to put that next to that word privilege, a white privilege in particular. So I just was taking advantage of that opportunity to expose you. Thank you. Joanne, and I apologize for my singing. That probably was not, I hope it didn't hurt you. The same question. How do you understand your privilege as a white woman, and how is that informing perhaps some of the decisions that you're making in this work?
Well, yeah, it has probably meant everything in my life, really. My shoes that I'm walking in, and just seeing the shoes that other people in other parts of the world, you know, depending on where you are, what kind of privilege you have, and your class, or, you know, like Bob said, it has to do with religion and race and color and caste and all kinds of things. But I guess the thing that makes me think, and this was previous to taking the classes with David and the race dialogue and actually questioning, is a couple of years ago, one of my friends said something about, and you know, another white family I would consider privileged, about that her husband, like, she felt like he was being discriminated against. And I you know, I didn't have the training to ask, tell me more about that. What are the experiences behind you feeling like he's been discriminated against? Because to me, I've seen what discrimination looks like, and I don't see that. But I would have to have I'd have to have that conversation and that question. But I feel like I live in very privileged shoes in a lot of ways.
Thank you. The next question was initially intended to be asked to the panelists, but I'd like to ask it to the rest of you here today instead. How do you relate to the narratives that the panelists have shared? Kay, I'd love to start with you. I know that you shared in the chat, if you're willing to unmute yourself.
Well, yes, when I was growing up, I lived in Phoenix, Arizona. And when I stayed with my grandmother, there were 3 Caucasian families on the block, and the rest were Hispanic. But during that time, living with my father, I heard a lot of things. He had a name for everyone, and I knew as a child that that was not right. But the day that I invited the new kids that moved in to play ball in our backyard, and he we said no, and all we could do was hide behind the garage. And I will never forget the look on that boy's face. I'll never forget it. It was just really sad. And so that's how I have experienced that.
Thank you. Who else would like to share?
Well, we were living in Washington during one of the marches on Washington, Martin Luther King, and we lived in a very red neighborhood. And we collected towels and soap for the people down at the mall. And when we came to move to a larger house with a fourth child on the way, the rumor was spread that we would only sell to niggers. And that was because our church welcomed 2 students from Howard University to our church. And we kind of took them under our wing, and we had them visit in our house quite a few times while they were studying at UNO. I mean, not UNO, in Washington, Howard. And so that was the rumor that was spread. And I remember being very careful to park the baby carriage away from a window, because some people who were doing what we were doing got bricks through their window.
Thank you. Betty?
Thank you. So I'm 60 years old, and I grew up in South Omaha, the old South Omaha. That is as far south as you can go before you get to Bellevue. And my mother was Roman Catholic, and my father came from an Orthodox Jewish family. So when they got married, their families were divided. And so it wasn't until they started having children, there are 5 of us, that they started to parent as, you know, a family. But where we grew up, it was very culturally diverse. We had friends who were from Austria, Bohemia, Poland, Russia, Lithuania, a lot of Slavic countries. And then there is the Black community in South Omaha that's embedded in between all of these other enclaves. And my parents, I'm just so thankful that they were my parents. They were both in medicine. They met at the VA hospital. My dad moved from California to Nebraska to find a wife. He always wanted to be a farmer. And he met my mother. And he always had a very diverse group of friends. And in the Omaha VA in the 1950s, when he came, he was one of 3 Jewish people that worked at the hospital. And they were categorized into groups as if it was a racial divide. His best friends were Black men and women, and they were all in the janitorial service, or his coworker who was another physical therapist. My dad was a physical therapist. And so I grew up from my birth through high school with my mother and father's friends and in the neighborhood. And I don't remember a year in my life that I didn't see something or experience something that was sad. With my father, he learned to resent, you know, his work environment and the people that he worked with because of how they treated George. George was his best friend, and we hung out with that family. And my best friends, my nickname was Keyboard. So that kind of tells you that most of my friends were Black boys and girls. And you would just see the disparity in housing and healthcare and food insecurity just because of what they were able to be provided or take advantage of. And in that part of the city, if you weren't white, then you definitely were separated out. So fast forward, I'm 60 years old, and for the last 30 years, I've been working in health and human services with children and families, and I'm in child support. And I still see it every day. Whether, I am a white woman working with predominantly group of men and women who have an obligation to support their family, and they're in the Black community. And in my line of work, I'm required to look at what they're ordered to do by the court and hold them accountable. But yet I have to have empathy and look at what's their real life situation. And so I don't see things have changed at all from when I was young to today for the Black community. One thing that I do notice with the young women and men that I work with, there is not enough diversity in government, in the representation to the men and women that we serve, that we're not hiring them to be in positions that they can influence how government operates in serving those populations or those services. Like job opportunities, there are so many things that we can do that we choose not to. I believe we choose not to.
Thank you.
So for me, that's kind of what my concern is.
Thank you. Karen, I do see your hand, Bob. Please add on.
Sure. Betty, thank you very much for your comment. I just want to talk about what's important. And that, what I think we're trying to do is enhance the number of people who are in the thought community of allyship. What does it mean to be a white person in a racist environment? What are you trying to do? And Betty, I would encourage you to try and find a story in your own life where it demonstrates actual racial progress. Because if the person you're talking to feels that all of this systemic racism language is bullshit, and you want to be in dialogue with them, it's no place to start by saying nothing has changed since the 1950s. Because they objectively know that that's not true. That doesn't mean we don't have serious problems today. As much as you can talk about racial progress, you can talk about racism in our current environment as well. But I think trying to understand that there's two levels to this. One level is the facts of history. Unfortunately, in today's world, we don't know enough about facts, or there are disagreements about facts. But the facts is what's in your head. What happened in Omaha, what the history of redlining is, all the sort of historical facts. That's important to know and important to defend and important to understand. They are burdened by historical revisionism and unexamined history. But what we're really trying to talk about is the heart. And in the heart, you're trying to establish a community of dialogue, even with people who don't agree with you. And unfortunately, there are too many people who don't see that there is racism in this country, who don't see that there's systemic racism, who don't agree that that people are held down and restricted by what they can choose just on the basis of the color of their skin. So if we want to open the dialogue, we have to be very aware of that norm.
I agree. I try to enhance my relationships with because most of my day is I'm at work. I'm a workaholic. And so I do try to develop relationships with, because I'm in management. So you always have to, balance those types of relationships. But we try to engage in what we do individually to improve those relationships and our impact on the community. Maybe that was a little bit far. Things have changed, but
so I am
long ago.
Karen, I do still acknowledge your hand. If you could add perhaps just a brief comment, that'd be great. I want to make sure that we walk away with some tools today. So, but I don't want to cut you off. So a quick nod your direction. You're muted.
Yeah, I knew growing up because sitting on the outside looking in, I knew inherently that there was racism, but I didn't know how bad it was. It was, never explicitly said from a family until one day, college, I call home because a young man from Liberia had asked me what my father thought of interracial marriage. I knew, but I wanted to hear it in so many words. And I asked my father, and he said, if you ever show up and he's with you, I have a 357. And the tone of voice that let me know he would use that gun. Fast forward to today, and I sitting in a hospital room with a friend who's Black and watching how nurses and doctors treated her. And we get to see that there are differences in everything and how she was treated for her pain or not treated. Things that I know I would not have experienced sitting white because I saw the difference when I'm treated for pain as compared to her. And
Thank you.
it's hard. It's everywhere.
That is very real. So I'd like to think about Suzanne and Joanne and Bob offering. You've completed this training, and I'd like to know how you have deepened your understanding of racism in practical and in kind of Bob's words, forward-facing tools that you feel that people who showed up today should know. Suzanne, how about if you go first?
Well, Joanne and I have taken the class and paired up, which has been wonderful. I'm glad she answered my invitation for a partner, a co-facilitator. We are offering classes in the Omaha, actually on Zoom, so it doesn't have to be in Omaha, they could be anywhere. And we do classes on either 3 Saturday mornings from 9 to 10:30 or 3 Mondays from 7:30 at night to 9. Those are the times we found we both had compatible. What I like about this, the race method, it breaks it down to what are the stories you have, like Bob was saying, what are the stories from your life that might make a difference in someone else's life? Just baby step. We're just planting seeds. We're not converting anybody in one conversation, but it's teaching that method of how can I plant a seed in someone's life to consider things a little differently, to expand their view of where we have made progress and how we've each experienced racism, because we don't talk about racism. And I have some conversations where I bring it up, and I've had people walk out of the room. They don't even want to answer. And I'm not being aggressive. I just bring up the topic. It's just a taboo. It's really hard. So we offer classes, and if I'll put in the chat our email, and if you're interested in a future class, let me know. We use David's method. It's RACE, reflect, ask, connect, expand. Those are the 4 steps. And we have done it, like we're doing a set of classes for the First Unitarian Church. We've done it for Nonviolence Omaha. So if you have a group that's interested, let us know that too. We have 4 openings in our next class, which starts at February 13th, 20, and 27th. We maximize as 18 people. We don't take more than that because we want it to be a really meaningful interaction for everybody.
So, and I will share that information in the follow-up email that I send out. Okay. Joanne, related to the RACE method, can you tell me what about that toolkit has helped you to understand how to shift your relationship as a white ally?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned earlier about my friend who was talking about how her husband had been discriminated against. And so that the whole learning process has taken me from just like, oh, I wonder what that means, to actually asking what in your experience, would bring you to that conclusion. So I think it has made me braver, because we do need to have conversations in our communities with our people that are our friends and our family that have views that are problematic. And the other thing is that was really powerful for me is that we all need to connect with our unconscious bias, and we all have unconscious bias stories. I mean, something that's happened. One of the things that happened to me just this summer was my husband and I and a couple of neighbors were distance walking around our neighborhood, and this kid on a bicycle went past us real fast. He had a tank top on, a baseball cap, a backpack, just like any other kid, except he was black. And I'm like, where did he come from? And it's like, okay, where did that come from? That I'm wondering where he came from, because our neighborhood is not very diverse, but I know that there's a couple African-American families that live in the neighborhood. So, just coming to realize that it's a virus. We all have these unconscious biases. And I think when we can find our stories and relate those to our friends that say things that are problematic and say, well, here, everybody has those thoughts. I've had them. And so it's having that confession part and coming into touch with my own unconscious bias. And even though I'm a good person, I feel like I'm a good person, but everybody has them. And it's something we need to all recognize, and we can use that as part of our tools to communicate and have compassion with other people who also have those.
Thank you. Bob?
Yeah, I think that the question you want to ask yourself is, do you want to be an agent of change? Do you want to be engaged in dialogue on this issue? Because I do think Wendy is right at the beginning. This takes a certain degree of bravery. You have to take some risk. You have to be willing to take some risk. And it's not that it's painful necessarily. It's actually quite enlightening and great. I would say that one of the things you want to know is who your audience is. Each individual person. So there are people who are skeptics. They call them racial skeptics. They don't believe it's a problem. There are people who are just unexamined. They don't actually have any feelings about it one way or another. They just never bothered to think about it. There are people who are on the road who understand that they're in a process of learning. There are allies, which I consider all of you are allies trying to figure out the right way to deal with these issues. And I do think that white people talking to white people is a more powerful thing. It's our responsibility to try and unpack this. As a white community, we have some responsibility here. It shouldn't be Black people coming into our community, LGBT people coming into our community, Native people coming into our community. We should look at our own biases and bigotries. And then I think we have to have our own stories. I think Joanne's right on target. It's about story. Story is the way you get to the heart. Story is the way you establish dialogue. Story is the way people learn. So I think we have to have our own stories. I think we have to keep in mind stereotypes. An often unexplored part of our bigoted lives, our unexamined bigotry is in stereotypes. And stereotypes are particularly complicated because in some cases they actually work and they have truth and they're short circuits for us to manage our lives. But when applied to human beings, stereotypes can lead to negative behaviors. So we have to understand how stereotypes work in our life. We have to understand microaggressions, how in our language, in our positions, just these little things, these 1,000 little things that people who are of the other experience. And then finally, I want to explain to those of you that are white and do not have an obvious other category that I grew up Jewish, and many of you have different backgrounds and each of you have to explore this for yourself. But people who are other, who have lived a life where they are the other, in whatever way you are the other, we get a special gift from heaven. And that gift I call minority radar. We have this little psychic radar that comes up. So if you say something that is bigoted, but it's from a heart of humility and honesty, and it's just from your background, and it's not aggressive, and it's not negative, and it's not meant as negative, we as people who have experienced this have a radar system that says, oh, let me talk to you about that. Let me correct you. Let me show you what that sounds like to me. And you need to understand that minority people, people that are the other, have that radar. And if you have that negative passion, it will come off as aggressive, racist, bigoted, anti-Semitic, whatever it is that's interpreted. If you have an open heart, it will come off as an invitation for a dialogue about the issue.
Thank you. Bob, you brought up a question that I want to go a little bit further about. So I know that a number of, well, Temple Israel and Countryside as examples, and many other faith institutions and others have, and bookstores and whatnot have started book clubs to read, you know, the books that I have read in the last year and that I'm sure many of you have, or in the last several years, around these topics. And I know that a common thread that came up in particular in both of the Commons congregation small group conversations was, okay, we read this book, but now we need you to go get some Black people to come talk to us about the experience. And, or I don't have any Black friends. And can you help me make some Black friends so that I can address this conversation? And I want to come back to the topic that we wanted to talk about here today was white allyship. And you noted that it's important for white people to do this job first with white people. Can you talk a little more about the value of that? And at what point in the journey do we imagine growing our tent of influence or friends or education to include particularly the racial other?
My belief is that the work, if it depends on where you are on the spectrum, right? If you believe you are a firm white ally and you are comfortable, the fact is you probably already have people who are other in your life. And if you don't have anybody who's other in your life, this work on white allyship is a way for you to expand your horizons in a wonderful way. Our communities are made up of a wonderful variety of people on all kinds of levels. The racial issue is the big bugaboo of America. So on the white allyship, I think we need to focus on that. And I do think that we should do the work ourselves, because if you don't, then when you encounter people who are the other in their own environments or in an environment that you're uncomfortable with, you may miss cultural cues. There is a definite different culture in the Black community, in the Hispanic community, in the gay community. These are different cultures. And if you are completely uncomfortable being around people who are different than you and your neighbors, or the people who have always been like you, most people are most comfortable with people who are exactly like them. And we surround ourselves with people who are exactly like that. That doesn't make you a bigot or a racist. It just makes you normal. So recognizing that and then expanding your horizons and your ability to understand this history of your own bias, your own unexamined stereotypes, your own unexamined things will allow you to open the gates and find more familiarity and more comfort with the other.
Thank you. Carrie, can you clarify your question? Who are you asking?
Sorry, I don't know that it was a question. I was just making people aware that someone said, like, how can I make Black friends? Well, this is not designed for that, but in terms of participating in dialogue in the Omaha area, the Omaha Council for Racial Justice and Reconciliation is one that I've done some activities with or watched some Zoom calls with, and I found it to be very enriching.
Thank you for sharing. Other questions?
Wendy, may I add something here?
Please.
We've talked a lot about Dr. David Camp's method and how it's influenced us, but I want to take a moment to lift up the Malcolm X Center and the Malcolm X Foundation, because it was their vision and their direction that saw this need in Omaha for people to, part of what was happening, white people after George Floyd wanted to kind of overwhelm the Black organizations that were already doing good work, and they kind of didn't want to be overwhelmed. And so I really see that the X Center is a part of everything we are doing. They started it, they contacted Dr. David Camp. They found who in the Omaha community, they made available to anybody interested. And their vision and their leadership is just a precious gift to the Omaha community. And they do, just aside, they've opened up for tours again by appointment. So if you've never been to the Malcolm X Center, it's on 18 acres of land, and it's actually where Malcolm X was born. Make a point, make an appointment and go out and see the center. It's a lovely, lovely place with a beautiful energy. Thank you.
But just as a point, for those of you that don't know the history, Malcolm X's family he was born in Omaha, but they left Omaha after a bigoted event where they were burned out of their house, and they moved out of Omaha.
And actually, you know, wanting to get to know people, other people, one of the sessions that they had at Malcolm X was volunteering for a Black organization and the do's and don'ts for volunteering. Because a lot of times people go into an organization and, you know, they want to like change it and make it better, and you could do this better. It's like, no, just do what they ask you to do. They know what they need, and you just help. So if you do end up volunteering, just be conscious that you're there to help them with their needs. And if they discover that you have a talent in something, they'll probably ask you to help them with that.
Thank you. I've added a survey about our program evaluation for today. We'd love you to consider taking a minute to give us some feedback about today, honoring that that we have decades of work ahead of us. We didn't intend for this to be anything other than an opening. So Anne, I see that you have something to share.
Yes, back to the comment that was made concerning we need to have more people in positions that can grow up into other positions. I am not a native Omaha. I lived here in 67 and 68, and I've lived here since 73, and I don't intend to move. So I consider myself an Omahan, even though I was an Army brat. But I have noticed, and I noticed the minute I got here, how divided it is. The first time we lived here, my husband was with Northern Natural Gas. We was with a realtor, looked in a house at Ralston, and she said, "Oh, you'll be so happy there are no Negroes living here." Now, I was only 24. If she had said that to me now, I would have said, "That's a shame. I think I'll look somewhere else." But I didn't. I just stood there. But if you look at our city council, our Douglas County commissioners, all that, they're white except for Ben Gray. My son in Beaufort, South Carolina, I go down there. If you go to a restaurant, which we can't now, of course, you see white faces, brown faces, black faces. You go to restaurants here, and what do you see? White faces. We are really, really divided here. And I hate to annoy any of you that were born in our fourth and fifth generations from here. I'm not putting Omahans down at all. I'm just stating a fact. You look at the politicians that have dark faces, they're from the South.
It's time, isn't it? It's time.
It's time. And Omaha is I think it's a unique place. We live in Harvey Oaks, which is on 144th and Center. I still say we, even though my husband passed away. When we first moved in, there was a homeowners association that a bunch of us started. And a man came over and said to my husband, "You know what homeowners associations are? They're to keep out Jews and Negroes." Well, my husband told me about that. At that time, I was still an Episcopalian, sort of. So I got in my car and I drove over. And I would, in a very nice way, I told the man off. And I came, told my husband, he said, "Why did you do that?" I said, "Honey, because you couldn't. I had to."
Right.
I was appalled. And this was in 1973.
Thank you, Anne.
Yes.
So in closing, Molly Welsh, who's with Inclusive Communities, has a great prompt for all of you. Thank you for being with us, Molly. She's reminding us that the Union for Contemporary Art has a red line exhibit, and I believe there's online information to be able to access that because of COVID. I encourage you, if that's not information that you've had previously, please consider checking that out. Thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you to all of you for having the courage to realize in the imagery of the poem that I started with that we are all connected in a circle, right? And I try to think of that in a circle of hope. And so may you go upon your day with the open-hearted message that this was intended to inspire in each of you to move forward in action and to continue showing up. So thank you so much. I appreciate your time today. Be well.